The summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln privately believed he was going to lose the presidential election. He believed it so completely that on August 23rd of that year, he gathered his cabinet, asked each man to sign the back of a folded document without reading what was on the other side, and then sealed the paper and locked it away. What was written on the inside was Lincoln's own acknowledgement that his successor would almost certainly reach the White House on a platform of negotiated peace with the Confederacy, and that when that happened, Lincoln would cooperate with the transition even though it meant the war ending and a separate Southern nation surviving as a permanent feature of the North American continent. He was not being dramatic, he was being accurate. The war had run for 3 years and consumed lives at a rate no one had imagined possible when it started. Grant's spring campaign had produced casualty lists so long and so relentless that Northern newspapers were openly calling him a butcher. Sherman was deep in Georgia, but Atlanta had not fallen yet. The Confederate Army was still in the field, still holding the ground that mattered, still killing Union soldiers at a pace that made the whole enterprise feel interminable to voters who had been promised, year after year, that decisive victory was just ahead. The peace movement inside the Democratic Party was not fringe politics. It was mainstream. And somewhere in Richmond, Jefferson Davis and his government had genuine reason to believe that if they could hold on just a little longer through summer, through October, through November, the American electorate would accomplish what Confederate armies had not quite managed. The North might vote to stop the war and let the South go. They almost pulled it off. And that near miss, that sealed document, that August calculation by a sitting president that he was probably going to lose, is the best entry point into the question this video is actually asking. Because if Lincoln was genuinely worried about losing in August 1864, the South had reached the edge of what it had always needed to reach. It had made the war expensive enough, long enough, and grinding enough that the Northern will to continue was genuinely cracking. So how did a Confederacy that came that close end up surrendering at Appomattox 8 months later? The Confederate States of America entered this war. This war should have been decisive. They did not need to conquer the North, capture Washington, or destroy the Union Army in one catastrophic engagement. They needed to do something far simpler and, historically, far more achievable. Make the war too costly and too prolonged for the Northern public to sustain the political will to continue it. That strategy had worked for the American colonies against Britain in the Revolution. It had worked for the Dutch resisting Spanish imperial power across 80 years of warfare. It had worked for smaller powers against larger ones throughout the history of organized conflict. The Confederacy entered 1861 with a real military officer class, a genuine diplomatic play in Europe, favorable geography, and a strategic concept with strong historical precedent. The question that has occupied historians ever since is a simple one. Why did it fail? The answer is not one lost battle or one catastrophic command decision, though there were both. It is a cascade of structural failures, political miscalculations, and fundamental contradictions that were embedded in the Confederate project from its first day, and that no amount of battlefield brilliance could permanently outrun. Start with what the Confederacy genuinely had going for it, because the advantages were not imaginary and they were not small. The South was fighting a defensive war on its own territory. That meant shorter supply lines, familiar terrain, and a civilian population with direct and personal motivation to resist invasion. Union armies pushing into Confederate states faced the classic invader's dilemma. They had to advance, hold what they captured, protect supply lines stretching hundreds of miles back to the north, and simultaneously fight an opponent who knew the roads, rivers, and geography intimately. The sheer size of the Confederacy, 11 states spread across nearly 700,000 square miles, was itself a strategic resource. The Union had to go everywhere. The Confederacy only had to make going everywhere cost more than the North was willing to pay. The Confederate military officer corps in the war's early years was exceptional by almost any measure. Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jackson, operating together in the Eastern Theater between 1862 and mid-1863, accomplished things with inferior numbers that military historians still teach as operational case studies. Jackson's Valley Campaign in the spring of 1862 pinned 30,000 Union troops who should have been reinforcing McClellan's drive on Richmond, doing so with 17,000 men, through a series of rapid movements and feints that left Union commanders perpetually uncertain of where he was going next. Lee, outnumbered at Second Bull Run, at Fredericksburg, and at Chancellorsville, won all three engagements. These victories were not luck. They reflected a level of operational creativity and psychological insight into enemy behavior that functioned as a genuine force multiplier, compensating for 2 full years for deficits in manpower and industry that should have ended the war much earlier. When Jackson was killed at Chancellorsville in May 1863, hit by friendly fire in the dark while returning from a scouting ride, the Confederate command structure lost something it could not replace. Jackson had been capable of independent action at the corps level in ways that no other Confederate general matched. He could be given an objective and trusted to accomplish it through his own initiative, on his own timetable, without needing constant coordination with Army headquarters. That capacity for independent operational command was extraordinarily rare, and when it died in the Wilderness Hospital, where Jackson spent his last days, it left a hole in the Confederate high command that every subsequent campaign exposed. Gettysburg, 2 months later, was in part a story about what Lee's army looked like trying to execute complex multi-corps operations without the man who had made those operations work. The Eastern Theater, where Lee and Jackson had built the Confederacy's reputation for military brilliance, was also not where the war was actually lost. The Confederacy lost the war in the West, slowly and then all at once. Vicksburg fell on July 4, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge failed at Gettysburg, and the fall of Vicksburg cut the Confederacy in two. The Mississippi River was now entirely in Union hands, severing Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest of the Confederate states. Those western states had supplied beef, horses, and material that the Confederate war effort east of the river depended on. Once the river was closed, that supply was gone. The Confederate loss at Chattanooga in November 1863 then opened the door to Georgia, to Atlanta, to Sherman's march, to the destruction of the agricultural and manufacturing base that had been sustaining Lee's army in Virginia. The Confederate commanders in the West, most notably Braxton Bragg, were not in the same class as Lee. They lost battles that more capable officers might have won, and those defeats had strategic consequences the Eastern Theater's successes could not offset. The diplomatic play, the card that Davis's government laid on the table in the war's first 2 years, looked, at specific moments, like it might actually materialize. The South's pre-war cotton exports had supplied roughly 80% of the raw material feeding British textile mills. Confederate commissioners argued, with some internal logic, that Britain could not indefinitely tolerate the disruption of that supply without acting. When Lee invaded Maryland in September 1862, part of the strategic calculation was that a decisive Confederate success on Northern soil would give the British government the justification it needed to move toward recognizing Confederate independence. The British and French cabinets were, in fact, in active discussion about joint mediation that autumn. The window was real. It closed for 2 reasons. Antietam blunted Lee's Maryland offensive and removed the military backdrop that European recognition would have required to be politically defensible. Then in January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and the diplomatic terrain in Britain shifted permanently. British workers might have tolerated supporting a Confederate nation in the abstract. They would not support one explicitly fighting to preserve slavery, not when Britain had spent 30 years constructing its national identity around abolitionism. The Confederate diplomatic mission in London kept producing optimistic reports for 2 more years, but after the Emancipation Proclamation, the window was closed. King Cotton had failed because British textile interests, while real, were not powerful enough to override the moral and political cost of intervention on the wrong side of the slavery question. These external failures might have been absorbed if the Confederate home front had remained politically coherent. It did not, and the reason it did not reaches to the deepest structural contradiction in the entire Confederate project. The Southern states had seceded primarily to protect the doctrine of states' rights, the principle that individual states retained ultimate authority and that no central government could legitimately override state sovereignty. That doctrine was the philosophical and rhetorical foundation of everything the Confederacy claimed to be. And then, The moment the Confederate government had to actually fight a modern industrial war, it discovered that doing so required precisely the kind of centralized authority the Confederate theory of government had always argued no legitimate power should possess. Conscription, centralized railroad coordination, government impressment of civilian farm output at prices set by Richmond, control of foreign trade. Every instrument the Confederate war effort actually needed ran directly into the governors and legislatures of the Confederate states, who had not left the United States in order to submit to a new version of the same federal authority they had rejected. Georgia's Joseph Brown and North Carolina's Zebulon Vance were not eccentric figures acting outside the political mainstream. They were experienced, elected politicians acting according to the precise constitutional logic that had animated secession. Brown withheld Georgia troops from Confederate service, citing states' rights. Vance stockpiled North Carolina supplies for in-state distribution, while Confederate soldiers in Virginia went without shoes and blankets, citing North Carolina's sovereign authority over its own resources. Both men were, by the framework the Confederacy had established for itself, technically correct. That was the trap. The principle that justified the Confederacy's existence was the same principle that prevented the Confederacy from functioning as a unified wartime state. Every time Richmond pressed the states for resources and compliance, it was arguing against its own founding doctrine, and the states knew it. Jefferson Davis understood the problem intellectually, and he pushed through measures designed to work around it. He got conscription through the Confederate Congress in 1862, the first military draft in American history, predating the Union draft by several months. He pushed impressment laws that allowed government agents to seize food, horses, and equipment from farms at government-set prices. He tried to centralize railroad management. And then he watched each of these measures generate exactly the political backlash that the states' rights framework made inevitable, because every measure required demanding from individual Southerners something the Confederate ideology had told them no government was entitled to demand. The conscription system's 20 Negro law became a symbol that the Confederate government could not diffuse. The exemption allowing one white man per plantation to remain home for every 20 enslaved people was designed to maintain agricultural output. What it communicated to poor white soldiers in the Confederate ranks was that the war was being fought by the people who could not afford to avoid it, while wealthy planters sat at home protected by a law that translated the ownership of human beings into an exemption from military service. The phrase that moved through Confederate camps was direct. It was a rich man's war fought on a poor man's body. That resentment did not burn itself out. It built. It built through 3 years of letters from home describing children without adequate food, farms unable to function without male labor, and prices for basic goods climbing beyond what any ordinary family's savings could sustain. The inflation those letters described was not incidental. The Confederate government could not adequately fund the war through taxation or bond sales, so it printed money. The Confederate dollar lost the bulk of its purchasing power by 1863 and continued deteriorating. Butter that had sold for 25 cents a pound before the war cost $10 or $15 by 1864. Salt, the essential technology for preserving meat in an era without refrigeration, became critically scarce after Union forces captured the Kanawha Valley Salt Works in Western Virginia early in the war, and families across the South struggled to keep food from spoiling through summer months without it. The Union naval blockade, which tightened year by year as the Union Navy expanded, made importing salt and other basic commodities increasingly difficult. Blockade runners, when they got through it all, prioritized luxury goods over necessities because luxury goods generated the profit margins that justified the risk of the run. In April 1863, women in Richmond marched on the commercial district and seized food from shops and warehouses. Davis appeared in the street, addressed the crowd, and reportedly threw coins into it before informing the women they had 15 minutes to disperse before the militia opened fire. Similar actions followed in Georgia, North Carolina, and Alabama over the next several months. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were organized expressions of a home front that had been pushed past the point of quiet suffering. Confederate soldiers in the field received letters describing these conditions, and the letters had a specific and documented effect on desertion rates that no military discipline could adequately address. By the winter of 1864, Lee was writing to Davis with an honesty that his earlier correspondence had not required, describing desertion not as a disciplinary failure or a character flaw among his men, but as a rational decision by men who had been placed in an impossible position. The letters from home made staying in the ranks feel like choosing the Confederate cause over a man's own family. Many of them chose their family. Lee's army, which had numbered around 70,000 men after Chancellorsville in May 1863, was below 50,000 by the time Grant crossed the Rapidan a year later, and the losses from combat and desertion combined meant that the replacement pipeline the Confederacy had hoped to draw on was running dry. The men who stayed fought in conditions that deteriorated year by year. By the winter of 1863 and into 1864, Confederate soldiers in Virginia were receiving rations that Lee himself described to Davis as barely adequate for men doing no physical labor, let alone for men being asked to march 20 miles and then dig earthworks. A quarter pound of meat per day, cornmeal when it arrived. Coffee had been gone for 2 years, replaced by roasted grain or chicory that tasted nothing like the real thing. Shoes wore out and could not be replaced in adequate numbers, and the image of barefoot Confederate soldiers that became a staple of lost cause mythology was not mythology. It was the documented reality of a supply system that had been asked to do more than it was built to do. The manpower math had always been unfavorable. The 11 Confederate states had a white population of approximately 5.5 million people, against roughly 22 million in the Union states. The Confederacy's total population, including roughly 3.5 million enslaved people, was 9 million. The military-age white male population that the Confederacy could actually draft was somewhere around 1 million men, and by the middle of the war, a substantial fraction of that population was already in the Army or dead. The Confederate Congress debated arming enslaved men as soldiers throughout 1864 and finally passed legislation authorizing it in March 1865, 1 month before Lee surrendered. It was far too late to matter, and the debate itself had revealed the Confederacy's deepest contradiction. A nation whose entire social and economic order rested on the premise that enslaved people were property, not persons, was now contemplating asking those people to die for its survival. Davis was also, for all his formal credentials, badly outmatched by the politician on the other side, and this mattered as much as any military engagement. Abraham Lincoln came to the presidency with one undistinguished congressional term, no executive experience, and a reputation that members of his own eventual cabinet considered unimpressive. He turned out to be one of the most gifted wartime executives in the history of democratic government. He managed a cabinet of men who had wanted his job and believed they were better qualified for it. He held together a northern coalition stretched across enormous disagreements about race, federal authority, and the war's ultimate purpose. He communicated with the American public in language that was direct and honest without being simplistic, and that gave people a frame for understanding what the sacrifice was for at the moments when the sacrifice felt most unbearable. He understood with complete clarity that he was fighting two simultaneous wars, a military war against Confederate armies and a political war for Northern public opinion. He never allowed either one to be sacrificed for the other. Davis, by contrast, was a man of genuine intelligence and real military knowledge who was temperamentally unsuited to the political demands of the job the war required. He feuded with Johnston, Beauregard, and Bragg so persistently that the dysfunction consumed time and political capital that neither he nor the Confederacy could spare. He could not build a working relationship with the Confederate Congress, which spent significant portions of its time on internal disputes rather than on legislation the war required. He never found a formula for managing the governors that preserved the states' rights ideology while building the functional central authority the war demanded. He attempted to thread a needle that, given the constitutional structure of the Confederacy, could not be threaded. Atlanta fell on September 2, 1864. Sherman took the city, the news reached the North within days, and the political atmosphere shifted faster than either side had fully anticipated. Lincoln, who 6 weeks earlier had been writing a private memo preparing for his own electoral defeat, won the presidential election in November with 55% of the popular vote. The peace movement was decisively rejected. The Northern electorate voted to continue the war and to continue it until the Confederate armies were beaten in the field. That vote cast in courthouses and schoolrooms across the northern states. Not in any military engagement ended the war more certainly than any battle had. The Confederate strategy had always been a race between Southern military endurance and Northern political will. After November 1864, the race was over. Sherman's subsequent march to the sea and then north through the Carolinas demonstrated something about the Confederacy that military engagement alone had not fully exposed. Sherman moved through Confederate territory with roughly 60,000 men against a combination of forces that by every conventional measure should have been capable of making his march far more costly. They were not, because by late 1864, the Confederate logistical system, political structure, and military replacement pipeline were all functioning below the threshold required to mount the kind of sustained resistance the geography allowed. Sherman's march succeeded not because of what his army accomplished in the field, but because of what Confederate collapse had already made possible. He was not cutting through a functioning nation-state. He was cutting through one whose vital systems were already shutting down. Jefferson Davis spent the remaining decades of his life insisting that the Confederacy had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and resources, that the South had been ground down by quantity rather than defeated by quality. The argument was not entirely without foundation. The numbers were real. The industrial differential was real, and it was enormous. The North produced something like 90% of the country's manufactured goods, controlled the existing railroad network, and had a naval capacity that could blockade 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline in ways that grew progressively more effective as the war continued. Grant's strategy of sustained attrition was built on an accurate reading of that industrial reality. But raw material advantage has never automatically determined the outcome of asymmetric conflicts. The British held commanding superiority in manpower and industrial capacity over the American colonies in 1775 and still lost. The French had overwhelming advantages over the Viet Minh in Indochina in the 1950s and lost. What distinguished those cases from the Confederate case was not the size of the gap, but the presence or absence of the political coherence needed to exploit the strategic position. The colonies and the Viet Minh had governments and military structures capable of matching their institutional design to what the war they were fighting actually required. The Confederacy had the strategic concept and the initial military talent. It never built the political foundation capable of sustaining those assets through 4 years of grinding attrition. The Confederate States of America went to war defending a constitutional principle that made organizing the war nearly impossible. It pursued a diplomatic strategy resting on leverage that proved less decisive than assumed. It attempted to sustain a home front under the pressure of inflation, scarcity, and class resentment, without the leadership capable of holding that home front together through the war's worst stretches. It ran a prolonged attrition campaign against Northern will, while its own will eroded from within through desertion, through bread riots, through governors withholding resources Richmond needed, through the slow hemorrhage of a government fighting with one hand tied behind its back by its own founding ideology. Lincoln was building something new and durable. Davis was defending an existing arrangement. In the end, the war was decided not primarily on the battlefields where Lee outgeneraled his opponents, though it mattered enormously that Lee could only delay the outcome. Not alter it, but in the homes of people deciding whether the cost was still worth paying, and in the political structures determining which side could sustain the demand long enough to outlast the other. The South had a plan for the battlefield. It never had an adequate plan for the question that actually ended the war, which was whether the society behind the battlefield had the coherence to hold together while the battlefield did its work. August 1864 was as close as they got. A sealed document, a president privately preparing for defeat, a Confederate government 8 months from surrender at a courthouse in Central Virginia. When Lee met Grant at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, the Confederate nation that had come so close to achieving its strategic objective was gone. The armies had not destroyed it. The politics had. The Confederacy had been unable to build the kind of centralized war-making state that the conflict demanded, while simultaneously honoring the decentralizing principles that had given it its reason for existing. It had been unable to hold together a home front society under pressures it lacked the administrative and political tools to manage. and it had been unable to outlast a Northern opponent whose political leadership proved, in the end, more equal to the demands of the war than Richmond's ever was. The margin, in the end, was not numbers or industry, though both mattered considerably. It was the distance between what the Confederate project needed to be in order to survive and what, by its own design, it was ever capable of becoming.